When we build or when we buy into a community, into a building, we probably assume that, you know, the governments, the councils, the developers have all done their due diligence, they've all done their homework, they've built these buildings or prepared these areas, opened up this land for availability. We assume that they develop properties on areas that are not going to be affected by previous events that they've seen. And that they also have those plans in place. You know, what are the disaster plans for an event like a flood? Yes, there's a certain amount of government, state, federal, local planning that exists, but that's not going to cut it down to the site-specific level of communities. We do need to be more engaged about preparing ourselves for what affects us, not just the broad picture of, you know, evacuate or leave.
And interestingly, if you look at the 1931 flood map, which is a flood that's not talked about a lot, or the 1974 flood map, the overlays are the same. It's really interesting. I've actually gone through the exercise of putting 1893 and all of stacking them all up. And the footprint of the flood grows, but it never really changes. If you're in a floodplain and you're a low-lying area, that's where the flood's going to go. So it is a very interesting exercise historically to look at where that flood path is.
We're standing at quite an important piece of infrastructure for the building that I live in. We use timestamp photographs to identify what the levels were here as the flood took place. And because this level here has become such an important known point for us, we've actually created our own flood gauge. These are important to where we live here at Riverpoint, because at this point here, which is 4 metres, Energex cut the power to 2 of our transformers. At 4.5, at this point here, our basement is starting to go underwater. Where we're standing is only about a metre above the high water mark. And 5.4, which is about as far as I can reach, is the level that the 2022 flood got to.
We're here on the day of the AFL Grand Final in September 2024, and we are having a community workshop called Flood Planning Conversations. We've got about 40 people that have come here in West End Kurilpa to talk about how they can continue working on their flood mitigation planning, particularly in their buildings.
We've been using the Kurilpa Flood Resilience Toolkit, and while it was a bit of a challenge at the start, it is so worthwhile to do. As a body corporate, we realise the impacts that can actually occur to our building, our lifts, our infrastructure, our resident safety. So not being prepared is not an option, and I think in the overall scheme of everything, we're looking to save money for our building and making sure that we are protected moving forward, and also have that resilience for our residents as well.
So West End's been a really interesting place where it had single dwelling houses, many of which washed away in the 1893 floods. And it's now unrecognisable. It's hugely gentrified. There's huge amounts of building going on. There's high-rise. It's a very, very different community. There's a lot more people living there. It's made the flood profile really different. And the thing I'm seeing is that with increasing development in that area, we're putting more people at risk. It's going to get harder to get away. We have to think really differently about how we'll manage floods in the future.
I've lived in the suburb of West End since I was 17. I'm now 63. Yeah. So I've seen West End change over a long period of time. For example, the building in the background, before that was an apartment block, that was the School of Distance Education. Even though I was not affected by the floodwaters, the loss of power in my unit affected me greatly because I got medication in my fridge that needs to be cooled and my power chair that needed to be charged. I was evacuated to a nearby hotel at South Brisbane in Cordelia Street, opposite Musgrave Park. We thought we were safe at the time because the water wasn't going to come up here. But the next day, we were watching the water rise throughout the night, but we thought nothing of it at the time until the following morning when we were able to see out through the windows clearly. And that's when it hit us that the hotel was surrounded by water. I could hear the water in the bottom of the lift well as I was coming down.
Behind me is the Riverpoint complex. It was built in 3 stages between 2008 and 2016. It is built over 3 hectares, so it's a large complex, and it's got 10 buildings, 700 residents, 15 lifts, and the whole thing is built on a podium. So it's all sitting on a concrete slab over a basement car park, which is all below flood level. So not only do we have the issue of potentially overland flow impacting on our buildings, but we also have stormwater from rainfall that goes directly into our building. Certainly in 2022, we were unable to remove that from the basement. The basement itself is 3 hectares of underground car park, effectively, and is all below the river level. Roughly where we're standing here at the bottom of the ramp is just 1 metre higher than the slab on the pergola down by the river. Over here is an example of one of the impacts is we've got our 2 lifts here, which are serving Building 7. There's 15 lifts in total. On that Saturday morning, everyone's trying to get their personal possessions out of the cages. And so everyone was using the lifts. Mm-hmm. So when Energex cut the power off with no notice, the lifts were in the basement. So all 15 lifts were below the flood level. The number one thing for body corporates and residents to enhance as a result of what we've learned in 2022 and 2011 is know your building, understand how it functions and where it's weak and where it needs more resilience. So we have spent an awful lot of time here at Riverpoint investigating how this building functioned during the 2022 floods and also 2011. And that's enabled us to do a lot of infrastructure works which makes us more resilient, including improved electrical networks, enhancing our pumps, building flood walls, installing temporary flood planks, and so on. So that's kind of the first phase of where you go in terms of how do you respond to this? How are you going to make yourself more resilient in the future? The second phase is to develop a plan. And we have a flood mitigation plan template on the Resilient Kurilpa website, which will help to guide people through that process. And it's about planning first, not just doing the infrastructure works. What information do your residents need? What is the body corporate's function? What do the emergency services do? How do you guide people? Because there isn't anybody else other than you and the body corporate, the residents themselves, to actually respond at that time. And recovery is really important. Doing all these resilient works and putting our planning in place means that we can recover quicker. And it's a lot less complex than it was in 2022. The flood mitigation plan itself can be quite a daunting document when you first open it. It appears that it might need technical input, and there are some buildings that will need that. But at least it's a starting point that can guide you through the things that you need to think about.
I think the other question or the other conversation that comes out of living in an area that is vulnerable to climate events is people think, oh, if I acknowledge this or if I talk about this, they think it's going to affect, the values of their properties or the value of a complex specifically, their individual homes, if they're on ground or if they're on 5, whatever levels. If you're living in this area and you own property and you think it's going to change with the value of those events, then even more so you should be, advocating and coming together and assisting to become better prepared and more resilient. Because as I mentioned earlier, there's a financial impact that you can mitigate by doing all of these preparation processes. But also the value I feel in these apartment communities that have been proactive and taken on the task of preparing and having plans and sharing that knowledge and transferring that knowledge to not only, the incoming committees and building managers, but to residents all the time, ongoing, not just 5 minutes before an event. But those buildings that are taking that on are actually acknowledging that they're going to be coming out of this event much better and with less financial impact. So your value would increase because you've got, 10 buildings along the river and 5 of them have got good, robust plans in place. They've looked at their vulnerabilities of their infrastructure, put plans in place to have backup power, flood planks, whatever is needed to protect the assets of the building, the big costs. And you've got 5 buildings that haven't. It's too hard. They don't want to talk about it because they're scared that it might impact, you know, their values or people wanting to come and live there, rent there, own there. So if I was coming into the community as a new person and I had that knowledge, the one question I would be asking is what planning or what infrastructure you put in place in this building? Have you got a self-insured sinking fund that deals with those financial costs? And I know that they're a proactive community that is going to be ready to deal with it rather than in a building that hasn't.